I can't not react to the anime apartheid Zionists making a video on Israel-Palestine history. And from people who watched it before me, who told me about it, they said that there's a lot of mask-off moments in this video. So we're going to try and go over as much of it as possible.
Palestine. There'd always been Jews living in Palestine, but there was a huge influx of immigration because of Zionism and anti-Semitism in Europe. And that's really when the conflict starts. Because I don't know if you know this, but people tend to not like immigrants. People tend not to not like refugees, and a lot of refugees coming all at once.
That's not really the case. The problem that people had with Jewish immigration, Zionist immigration, Palestine, was that it was specifically with the goal of taking large swaths of land and taking them for the exclusive use of Jews in order to form an ethno-state. That was the issue that people had from the very beginning. She's trying to frame it like as some sort of modern anti-immigrant thing, when clearly it very much wasn't. The problem was that these people were coming there and settling with the goal of eventually forming a sort of Jewish-dominated state that would either oppress or exclude the non-Jewish population. That is the issue with the formation of Israel, okay?
I know lefties normally love that, though for some reason they make an exception when it comes to...
There never would have been any issue with the formation of Israel, at least nowhere near on the level that it's an issue now, if they had not insisted on, like, 2 states. That was a solution that the vast majority of the population that had been living there continuously for far longer never agreed to and never remotely wanted. That's the issue. A 1-state solution with full citizenship for everyone would have been totally fine.
The Israeli-Palestine conflict. But that's when the conflict really begins. But that doesn't mean that the seeds of the conflict weren't there beforehand. So in a way, like, the area of Palestine has always had a lot of problems for thousands of years. As I've talked about. So I think that that's why people say it goes on for thousands of years. It's really just kind of like a language thing. But where I really agree with Vox here is that it's not, the core of the issue is not religious. Like, religion adds fuel to the fire. That's how I'll describe it. But the fire...
Right, the core of the issue here is the settler-colonial relation between people who essentially came in and took a bunch of land, to rule themselves from its original owners, in many cases, when the people who had lived there for much longer than the majority of these people, of this other group, didn't want that to happen. That's the fundamental beginning of the conflict, but she's gonna frame it in a different way.
Will exist with or without religion. It's very much about ethnic groups, like, claiming the same land.
It's not just about ethnic groups claiming the same land. You got one of these groups that clearly came with the intent to take a lot of the land for themselves. At least most of the people of that group, or who imagine themselves to belong to that group, came with that intention. And a much larger group that had lived there continuously for far longer that didn't want the other group to just take like half of it for their own exclusive use. Very simple stuff.
It's a geopolitical land issue. You take religion out of the picture, and I guarantee you it will still be a problem. Maybe not as intense of a problem, but it will still be an issue.
And it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman...
No, Zionism actually would totally exist without Judaism. A lot of people have a misunderstanding. So Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people, but the Jewish people exist without that religion. And I think that that is one of the larger misconceptions. I think people have this idea, and it's probably a Christian idea or a Muslim idea, right?
Because, I mean, the Jewish people are defined by their religion. The idea of a Jewish people is a religious one. If it wasn't, then there wouldn't be such a continuation for thousands of years. That's why we call it an ethno-religion, and not just like, do I need to speed her up even more? She's already sped up. Okay, I will.
Christianity and Islam they're purely religions. Anyone can become that. They're not based on some kind of ancestry or anything like that. Whereas being Jewish is much more like being Romani or being being indigenous, right? Like a part of an indigenous.
Being indigenous
tribe. It's like you can trace your lineage to a tribe, right? You were kicked out of your indigenous homeland, and some people.
Indigenous homeland. I've said this before, but the settler-colonial relation has to do with more immediacy, right? It's not like I was kicked out of this place 2,000 years ago, or I imagine that I have a connection to my distant ancestors who were kicked out of this place 2,000 years ago. Ergo, I have a right to come here and take the land from the people who already live there. That's not how it works. Whatever imagined connection you have with 2,000 people 2,000 years ago is as valid as my imagined connection to fucking Alexander. It's not real. What makes the Jews who moved to Palestine during this period in the late 19th, early 20th century settlers has nothing to do with ancestry and everything to do with the fact that they moved there and stole the land, literally settling and colonizing the land. In their own words, they said that, from the people who had lived there continuously for much longer than they had. The continuity is the most important part.
Have the religion, some people don't. A lot of people still have aspects of the culture, but that kind of thing, it's a very, very different dynamic. That's why it's called an ethno-religious group and not just a religious group. So that's why Zionism would exist without Judaism, because even if all Jews were atheists, right, it doesn't actually affect their historical connection.
This is like a really auxiliary point. It doesn't really fit with anything that we're talking about. But if all Jews were atheists, then like Jewishness as something that people strongly identify with would wither away within a few generations. It's an ethno-religion. And I'm not saying that like in that's a positive or negative thing in any respect at all. Just that's what would happen. Like she thinks that there's like some sort of innate Jewishness or something that people have, but it's like any other culture. It's intrinsically linked with the religion. The most important part of Jewish culture is essentially religious.
Right, to the region. The same way, if a bunch of indigenous Canadians, like from say like the Mohawk tribe, suddenly stopped believing in their Mohawk religion, I'm not sure about the details of what they believe in, they wouldn't suddenly stop claiming Canada as, their home.
So she's trying to link that to like 2,000-year-old claim. Now, I'll tell you right now, if Mohawk people were like kicked out of their original homeland, lived in Europe for like 2,000 years, across like 20 generations, 25 generations, and then said, okay, we're going to go back to Canada and claim our land, it's still ours, that would be fucking ridiculous. What gives the Mohawk people a claim to indigeneity, a claim to their land in Canada still, is the fact that they're still an extant people who are the continuation of the same people whose land this was stolen from, reclaiming that land from the exact same state that stole it from them. In the case of Israel, there are Jews who absolutely are as indigenous in the sense of the settler-colonial relation to that land as Muslims or Christians are. That's why a lot of them identified as Palestinian Jews up until the formation of Israel. But that doesn't mean that everyone who shares a religion or an imagined ethnicity with them gets to move there and claim that it's equally theirs as it is for the Jews who have continuously lived there for 2,000 years. That's not how this works. It's a material relation. It's not some sort of mystical relation. It's not about imagination. It's about your actual relation to the land in immediate terms.
Because that's still their historical home. So it's not really
historical home. That's essentially just based on nothing but mythology.
As much about religion as you think. There's also a lot of religious reasons why you wouldn't support, Jewish religion reasons why you wouldn't support the creation of a modern Israeli state as initially Zionism.
This is going to take fucking forever. This is going to take forever because like it's such a long video and I have to respond in such detail.
It actually...
So let's see if we can get to the good parts. Dissecting 1948. Let's see.
Okay, so this was the original allocation of land. Remember, the Arabs rejected it. Okay, and they started war.
So the Arabs rejected the allocation of land and they started war. This is a talking point often used by Zionists, and it's important that we dissect this. The Arabs here, as in like the Christian, Muslim Palestinians, never agreed to this partition. It was a one-sided partition done on their behalf by foreign powers who, by the way, were lobbied incessantly by Zionist organizations to accept it. They rejected it because it's fundamentally unjust to be like, hey, half of your land, we're giving half of your land to people who 80-90% of them are quite recent migrants. We're dividing this land that has not been divided and giving half of it to these people on an ethno-religious basis and essentially making you second-class citizens in their new country that we're giving them. That's why this was so contentious. They never agreed to it. You can't just make a deal like this based on one side. It doesn't matter how much international support you have, you're excluding the other party from it completely. It's not legitimized because the fucking British Empire agreed to it. It's not legitimized because the great powers of the UN agreed to it. Only after incessant lobbying from Zionists, by the way, did they agree to it. The problem is that they divided this land. It's not that they were there. Sure, the immigration would have undoubtedly caused ethnic tensions and shit, but the fundamental problem of the formation of the Israeli state is that it divided the land and that the most of the population there who had lived there continuously for much longer than most of the people who claim this new state never agreed to it. So now she's going to be like the Arabs invaded, right?
The war starts, Israel wins the war. They should not have won the war. Okay, in fact,
The
most
war
people would
starts,
bet against
Israel
that.
wins,
There's a
it
lot of
wins
reasons
the
why
war.
they ended up
Nothing
winning
more,
it.
nothing
The
more
primary
to it, right?
reason is because of the arms help from Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union at the time was hoping for Israel to become communist because they were very lefty. So Israel ends up winning. It's a fascinating.
I'm pretty sure the reason that the Soviet Union supported Israel was because they had hope that like Israeli leftists could end up creating like a unified communist state from all of Palestine. Not that they could form like an Israeli ethno-state. And obviously they were wrong about that.
I love 1948.
Not because they were really lefty. They obviously were not really lefty. Like, give me a fucking break.
I shouldn't say it because in a way there were so many awful things that happened in the year. But I find it
I
a
love
fascinating war. First of all, it's a very long.
1948. She loves the Nakba was fucking awesome, dude. I love it.
It's a long war for such a small region. And on top of that, I know, surprise win for the USSR. But it's really ironic, of course, because the USSR ends up becoming an ally of Egypt against Israel later on.
Well, I wonder
which
why
is one of
that
the
might
reasons
be
why
the
Israel
case.
allies with the United States. You know, fun fact, right? They weren't original good allies. So Israel ends up winning that war, and that war there were so many awful things that happened in that war, and there is still a result of that war is that there's tons of refugees. So there are lots of Jewish refugees, but because Israel wins the war, the Jewish refugees just move to other regions within Israel. Especially Israel wins so much territory. You can see how much territory they win. They win territory near Gaza over here.
Which is just like they won territory. There's no examination of the fact of like whether like territorial expansion via conquest is actually a good thing, a valid thing to do. Just they won territory, it's theirs now.
They win territory in the northeast. They win territory really close.
And by the way, the reason why there was a war was because of what I just said. There was never any consent from the so-called Arab side, from the Palestinian side, to this. There was no consent. It was a one-sided agreement that divided their land in two arbitrarily, that they never agreed to. So of course they're going to fight back. And it doesn't matter if you win the subsequent war. They're the ones who are still obviously in the right there, because they'd never fucking agreed to it. Simple.
To Jerusalem, but not directly, right? And guess who else wins territory? And this is where Vox is being somewhat dishonest, because Israel was not the only winner of the 1948 war. Because there was another country that was created originally by the British. Look what's going on here. It's Jordan. So
Being dishonest.
Jordan ends up winning basically all of this territory. So this area is the West Bank. They win the West Bank. They win Jerusalem.
I mean, saying that they win the territory is also kind of dishonest there, because the reason why they quote unquote won the territory is because basically the Palestinians didn't have any sort of real state structure or military force at this time. So like essentially other Arab nations sort of went to bat on them you can say it was for their behalf, you can say that it was for their own interest, but either way they clearly were in the right to do so.
And it's never Lebanon yet. Never try yet. Don't get, like, all these Middle Eastern countries are very different from one another. So Jordan actually wins a lot of this territory. And this is why, like, this Vox thing, and when you see a lot of these maps, you know when you see, like, those maps of, like, where they show you the shrink. But yeah, it's true. We actually don't know. It's a huge debate between historians right now on what the cause of these. So there were 700,000 refugees that were Palestinian Arab refugees that were created out of this war. Historians to this day do not agree on what caused those refugees.
Well, I wonder what caused those refugees. Was it the massive fucking war and the theft of their land?
So Vox saying...
Yeah, like, she's like, historians disagree. Who disagrees? Israeli nationalist historians. That's who disagrees.
That implying that there's like some 100% fact implies that there's a historical consensus.
The Nakba was factually an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from this blue land. It's very simple. But of course, she's essentially denying genocide here, because I think it's very reasonable to call forced removals genocide.
And I think that's a little dishonest. I mean, it's not a little dishonest, it's very dishonest. There is no historical consensus, and
there absolutely is.
I have my opinion, and my opinion actually agrees with Vox. I agree in terms of the research that I've done and the research that I've seen in terms of the amount of historical, like, scholarly work that's being done. I think it's much more likely, right, that I would say largely Palestinian refugees were kicked out by Israeli forces. However,
then what is the point of you trying to cast doubt here?
Is because it leads to legal issues associated with the concept of a refugee status, with the right of return. I don't think Palestinians can ever get the right of return, because as Vox mentioned, there's over 7 million. Those 700,000 have now become 7 million in terms of their descendants. I don't think there's no room. They can't come there, and Israel still remain a majority state. So the only solution...
Did she just straight up say that Palestinians cannot be allowed to return to their land that they had lived on for generations previously, that was stolen from them by Israel, because then Israel could no longer be a majority Jewish ethno-state? She just said that. She's against the right of return for Palestinian refugees, but she's for the right of return for like random Jews who have nothing to do with Israel. Are you kidding me? This person is supposed to be like some sort of smart, like remotely leftist streamer.
Associated with the concept of a refugee status, with the right of return.
She's doing straight up ethno-nationalism here. She firmly believes in Israel as an ethno-state.
Palestinians can never get the right of return because, as the Vox mentioned, there's over 7 million. Those 700,000 have now become 7 million in terms of their descendants. I don't think that that's ever. There's no room. They can't come there, and Israel's
There's no room. There's no room. There was room for there before the land was literally stolen from them.
Remain a majority state. So the only solution to me is, if you think that Israel's the cause of the refugee problem, are financial reparation. And Israel does not actually have as much money as a lot of people.
So, like, essentially paying people for the land that you stole. I mean, that would certainly be better than nothing, but you can't just kick people out, pay them money, and be like, we have an ethno-state now. Honestly, that's kind of just coming out and saying the part that you're not supposed to be saying there, by saying that refugees should not be able to return to the place that they were kicked out of on ethnic grounds during a process of ethnic cleansing. That is like so mask off that I honestly find it difficult to believe that she actually said it.
So I think that that's the real financial reparations are the solution. But I think Israel would probably say, oh, well, what about all the Jews' financial reparations for all the regions that they were kicked out of in the last 100 years?
Well, there's kind of a bit of a difference there because most of those Jews were settlers. Though I absolutely would agree that any who were not settlers would rightfully be entitled to some sort of reparations, at least if they haven't engaged in the oppression of Palestinians since, which, they almost certainly have.
And that's part of the problem. But anyways, so just wanted to mention that Vox didn't...
Population, whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab and Jordan...
It changes nothing. It is essentially the same thing as Palestine, because that's where the Palestinians lived. Okay, I want to skip to some interesting parts that someone told me about on Twitter.
Settlements are, right? And you can't kick out settlements. You can, but it's really bad when that happens, right?
You can't kick out settlements. The Israelis, she's talking about present day settlements here, right? Just for the context.
And one of the reasons is because Israel's just constantly there's a lot of reasons why Israel struggles economically compared to other Western nations. Now, people see them as very strong because they are strong in comparison with Palestinians and other Middle Eastern countries.
Make no mistake, Israel in no respect is a Western nation, and calling them a Western nation is incredibly weird. It betrays a weird identification with the sort of imagined Western civilization, which doesn't exist, but which is very problematic and reactionary.
But I'm just comparing them to other Western right now. Okay, anyways.
Some settlements are cities with thousands of people. Others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians.
The settlements are the biggest issue. Honestly, out of every single thing, the discrimination against Palestinians, the checkpoints, the water issues.
I mean, I think the settlements are a big issue, but, the literal apartheid is also a huge issue.
Wait,
okay, let's finish this part, and then I'll see if she talked about apartheid.
Honestly, even the military occupation, the worst thing are the settlements because of how permanent settlements are, right? And you can't kick out settlements. You can, but it's really bad when that happens, right? Because then you're basically ethnically cleansing a region. And that's what happened in Gaza.
What?
When Israel pulled out of Gaza. Lefties all loved Israel pulling out of Gaza, right? And I do think it was the right thing morally to do. But the consequence of
So, for one, apparently kicking settlers out of a region, even if they're there blatantly doing settler colonialism, as modern-day Israeli settlers unambiguously are, even if you support the existence of Israel, they are. It's obvious, right? You can't deny it. It's ethnic cleansing to kick them out. For one, that's not true. Israel is an occupying power under international law. Settlements are illegal under international law. Obviously, it's completely legal to kick out settlers. And when I say settlers, I'm talking about literal, not hereditary settlers, actual current recent settlers who were implanted by an occupying power, 100% unambiguously illegal. Not hereditary illegal, it's not collective punishment. They're engaging in a war crime. So kicking them out is obviously not ethnic cleansing as she said it was. But it's kind of weird how she calls it ethnic cleansing, yet the previous unambiguous ethnic cleansing of actual Palestinians who had lived there for generations who were in no way settlers is apparently not ethnic cleansing. Now she talks about apartheid here.
That Israel is going to become an apartheid state. And all those lefties are going to turn out to be right when they criticize Israel, calling it apartheid. Because if they keep building the settlement and more settlements happen, it's going to be a more and larger of a human rights disaster to pull out and to get rid of the Jews from the region and give them back to the Palestinians. So it means that the only solution you're going to have is a one-state solution where everything becomes an Israeli state. The big problem with that is that for Israel to continue to exist as Israel and not just, become a non-Jewish state and...
Well, she's literally using the talking points of the far right in Israel who oppose settlement because they're worried that it will eventually end up with a one-state solution. This is exactly their talking point. Like, they specifically oppose Israeli colonialism because further Israeli colonialism rather, because they think that it will dilute the Jewish character of the Israeli state. And she's literally talking.
That's just a typical Arab country in the Middle East with an Arab majority population. Israel, and to remain with Western values and all those things, Jews need to remain the majority of the population.
Oh my God! This is. Do I need to say anything? This is. I didn't even know she was this bad. I didn't know she was this bad. We need Israel to be a majority Jewish ethno-state with Western values. You know, Western values. She's identifying with Israel in the way that like right-wing Christians do, you know? Let's listen to that again. I think it merits listening to it again.
It's disaster to pull out and to get rid of the Jews from the region and give them back to the Palestinians. So it means that the only solution you're going to have is a one-state solution where everything becomes an Israeli state. The big problem with that is that for Israel to continue to exist as Israel and not just, become...
So for her, like, even ignoring the fact that obviously a one-state... Now, I am for a one-state solution. I think it's the best solution. Anyone who is not for a one-state solution is an idiot in my book, or misguided at the very least. But, like, she's advocating against this extreme one-state solution where Jews basically settle all of the still remaining Palestinian territories and basically force the complete annexation of these territories and their population. And she's saying that that would be a bad thing, not because that's obviously incredibly fucked up, that obviously be essentially conquering those areas illegally in every single way, but because it would dilute the racial demographics of Israel and its Western culture. This is so mask off.
A non-Jewish state, and that's just a typical Arab country in the Middle East with an Arab majority population. Israel, and to remain with Western values and all those things, Jews need to remain the majority of the population. So if they're not the majority of the population anymore, right, because you're now including the entire region and Palestinians are coming back, what happens to all the citizens, all the people that are now in Israel, all the Palestinians that are now considered in legal Israel, because you probably don't trust them to give them normal rights and everything, because, I mean, you're literally just at war with them. So what are you going to do?
Give them equal rights anyway.
You're going to make them second-class citizens.
This is the reason that she thinks there is an apartheid in Israel is obviously because she probably thinks that... let's just see if she talk about apartheid at other points. I'm 100% sure that I know why she thinks it.
Whether or not Israel's an apartheid state. And I don't think Israel's an apartheid state because I don't include Palestinians as a part of that state. Right?
Okay, she doesn't include Palestinians as a part of that state. Now let's ask her, do you know that South Africa actually didn't include a lot of blacks as a part of South Africa? They were citizens of their Bantustan, which were basically special reservations created for them, which are directly analogous to Gaza and the West Bank. So even by the precedent of apartheid, she's wrong. But the real reason why Israel is an apartheid state is because functionally Israel and Palestine are one state. The ruling power, the overall real ruling power of Gaza and the West Bank that dictates everything about these places, everything that the people in there can and can't do, what can get in there, what can't, who can get in there, who can't, is Israel. Israel is the governing power of all of Palestine. Functionally, we already have one state. It doesn't matter if you think that technically Palestinians aren't citizens of Israel. It doesn't fucking matter because Israel rules them. Israel is at the highest level of the monopoly of violence in the Palestinian territories. Israel enforces apartheid in those territories based on denying the people who live there legal status, which is what apartheid South Africa also did a lot of the time. Functionally, we have one state, and we have for a very long time. That is why Israel is an apartheid state. Not because it literally says in its law, Jews are number one, though it does have laws that do say similar things. Jews number one, Arab citizens number two, Palestinian non-citizens lower class. Because functionally it operates as one state that exercises a monopoly of violence over both what it calls Israel and what is called Palestine, and it's that simple. And it treats the people who live in the part called Palestine as if they are essentially like a third class of citizen, honestly. But I mean, we need to go back to that mask-off moment because I think this should absolutely be played at any time that this person tries to insert themselves into a left conversation, because it is fundamentally disqualifying. This person is a far-right reactionary Zionist settler colonist who believes that Israel should be an ethno-state that privileges Jews over other citizens and that excludes non-Jews as much as possible, because she doesn't want to dilute it with Arabs who will dilute its Western values. She straight up said it.
Apartheid, because if they keep building the settlement and more settlements happen, it's going to be a larger and larger of a human rights disaster to pull out and to get rid of the Jews from the region and give them back to the Palestinians. So it means that the only solution you're going to have is a one-state solution where everything becomes an Israeli state. The big problem with that is that for Israel to continue to exist as Israel and not just, become a non-Jewish state.
Israel does not need to exist. We don't need to give a special state to the settler colonists just because they moved en masse to Palestine and then managed to conquer a part of it. The only just solution to the question of Israel-Palestine is one single state with equal rights for everyone within it, with no privileges for Jews, no privileges for Arabs, no privileges for Christians, no privileges for Muslims, no privileges for any group. Very simple. She wants the opposite of that. She wants a straight up Jewish ethno-state. And she's blatant about it. And she's somehow trying to frame this as woke. She's just coming out and saying this. I cannot emphasize how disgusting this is. How saying this about any other people, any other ethnicity anywhere would rightfully get you skewered as a reactionary, as a fascist.
That's just a typical Arab country in the Middle East with an Arab majority population. Israel, and to remain with Western values and all those things, Jews need to remain the majority of the population. So if they're not the majority of the population anymore, right, because you're now including the entire region and Palestinians are coming back, what happens to all the citizens, all the people that are now in Israel, all the Palestinians that are now considered in legal Israel, because you probably don't trust them to give them normal rights and everything, because you were literally just at war with them. So what are you going to do?
Because you were literally just at war with them, she says. You literally just conquered all of their territory, and she frames it as being at war. What happens in Israel is not a conflict anymore, okay? It is a settler colonial power that keeps the vast majority of the indigenous population in what is essentially reservations. That is apartheid. That is Bantustans. Simple.
You're going to make them second-class citizens. And voila, you start having an apartheid state. So I think it's very likely to become that. And that really
they're already third-class citizens, not even second-class.
I think every single time there's another settlement, it's more and more likely.
Her reason for opposing settlements is just unhinged. Not as a moral, not on a moral level, but because she thinks it will be inconvenient for Israel's status as an ethno-state in the future, as a Western bastion. Absolutely disgusting. Look, I think I'm going to stop there. I can't really stand this for much longer. Though I guess let's go conclusion and Eris's thoughts. Let's see, what's her conclusion?
I'm glad that they mentioned that. Thank you, Vox. I'm actually somewhat impressed by this. There's still some things that they've left out, but there aren't really any outright mistruths, and they're largely being somewhat fair. There's some things they've left out that I think are a little shitty, but they were probably trying to make a shorter video, and I think so I'm being kind of impressed.
Time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. But the Second Intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying.
Keep in mind, Israelis went into the year 2000 very, very ready to make peace,
Okay, when we talk about Israeli, making peace, Israelis wanting to make peace, Arabs not wanting to make peace, what they mean here is peace on Israeli terms. What they mean here is peace with what Israel is willing to give up in exchange for that peace, being generally very small amounts of Palestinian land. No right of return for Palestinian refugees, what is essentially a fundamentally unjust situation that does nothing to solve what is the original problem, which is the fact that two states were created against the will of the vast majority of people who live there. So what Israelis and Zionists do is they try to frame Arabs as unreasonable for not wanting to accept Israeli peace terms. And I'm sure that's what she's doing here. It would be like saying, goddamn fucking Poles not accepting the Nazis' terms for peace or whatever, the complete capitulation, blah, blah, blah. Yes, they don't accept peace. That essentially means that they give up any claim to what was stolen from them. That does absolutely nothing to right the fundamental wrongs. The only acceptable peace in this situation is a one-state solution where human rights abuses are held to account with the right of return for refugees. On both sides, though obviously this disadvantages the Israeli side because, they commit a whole lot more human rights abuses and stole a whole lot more land.
Leftists. And they come out of the Second Intifada in 2003, a few years later. I think it's 2003 or 2005. Sorry, my mind's they come out of it hardened, angry. Almost every single person that I know, almost every single Israeli I know has...
She's trying to frame this as a righteous anger. It's not. We have one group fighting for liberation against your bullshit terms that give you the exclusive ethnically based right to land that you originally stole. You don't have any righteous cause there. I don't give a shit about your indignation. I don't care about how pissed you are that the people who you oppress fought back with violence. They have every right to fight back with violence against you.
Lost someone in the Second Intifada. So just imagine what that does to your mindset. Because human beings are emotional. People
I don't
stop
care
having
about
suffering.
your mindset.
I talked about this with Anna. Suffering makes you selfish. So Israelis suffered during the Second Intifada. With that suffering, they become less empathetic to the Palestinian plight. They start saying, well, you're just trying to kill us and our children. Why do we give a shit about you anymore? We won. You're still just trying to kill us. And that starts becoming an attitude. of like, we try to make peace, you rejected our peace deal, and then you kill her, and then
Oh yeah, we tried to make peace on terms that advantage us, that do absolutely nothing to solve the fact that we stole this fucking land from you. We ethnically cleansed it of most of you. Unbelievable. You know, and we're still settling your land, but you know, you don't accept our peace terms. Noam Chomsky said once that everyone wants peace, even Hitler wanted peace. The question is, on whose terms are we talking about? Peace in Israel-Palestine is always framed as peace on Israeli terms. When Arabs who are an oppressed group in this situation, who are in the right in every single way, rightfully say no, they're framed as like some sort of like incredible, incredibly unreasonable, like basically savages who just love war. Us Israelis believe that we suffered at the hands of these unreasonable, warlike Palestinians. That you feel like they've wronged you in some way doesn't mean that you're actually wronged. Examine the situation. The people who are wronged here are not the Israelis.
try to wipe us out,
The people who are in the right are the Palestinians. It's very simple.
like, and kill our civilians. And now you're making us live in fear.
Kill our civilians, man. You kill like 100 civilians for every one they kill. And you always have. Give me a fucking break.
No, it's war now. It's war. And that starts becoming
It was already a very prevalent attitude. Israel has always been a Starship Troopers state, based on war. She says Israelis start becoming
so
more
Israelis
right-wing
start becoming much more right wing as a consequence.
as a consequence. Dude, you're already incredibly right-wing. You're a fascist ethnostatist who believes that Israel must be upheld as a Jewish ethnostate for the sake of Western values. Get out of here. Anyway, look, I can't stand this anymore. Zionists will just say the quiet part out loud, and they somehow won't even realize that they're doing it. And this is someone who claims to be like a leftist or at least a progressive liberal. Straight up saying it out loud. I can't stand it. It's honestly ridiculous. That this person is accepted in like supposedly left-leaning circles on Twitch as some sort of fellow traveler makes me sick. It disgusts me. This person is a ethno-nationalist. Straight up. An open ethno-nationalist who straight up says that they're an ethno-nationalist and who straight up talks about defending Western values like as a point for her ethno-nationalism. It's terrible. It's absurd. This says so much about Twitch politics. Makes me want to throw up.